The arrogant empire's challenge. The galaxy had always known the Zarnak Empire as a force to be feared. For centuries, their fleets of colossal starships had crushed resistance with ease. They considered themselves the pinnacle of evolution, unmatched in their power and technology. To them, other species were pests to be controlled or exterminated. When the Zarnak turned their attention toward human space, it was not out of necessity. Humanity's small cluster of colonies and modest fleet posed no threat to them. The Zarnak Empire simply wanted to make an example of these newcomers, to show the galaxy what happened to those who dared to exist without the Empire's blessing. At the edge of human space, a Zarnak warfleet appeared in a flash of blue light. Their flagship, Dominion's Wrath, was a monstrous vessel, over 10 kilometers long, bristling with weapons and glowing with energy shields. It was accompanied by dozens of smaller warships, each capable of devastating an entire planet. From the flagship, Supreme Commander Xalvar broadcast his ultimatum. His voice was deep and menacing, the universal translator ensuring every word dripped with contempt. Humans, hear the will of the Zarnak Empire. You are weak, insignificant. You have no right to exist in this galaxy. Surrender your worlds and your lives, or face annihilation. You have 1 hour to comply. The transmission was sent to every human colony, every outpost, and every ship. The Zarnak were certain there would be no reply, or at most, a plea for mercy. They had done this countless times before, and the result was always the same. But then, to their surprise, a response came. On the bridge of the Dominion's Wrath, Xalvar leaned forward, intrigued. The image of a human appeared on the central display. He was tall, with a commanding presence, dressed in a crisp navy uniform. His gray eyes met Xalvar's without fear. "This is Captain Adrian Cole of the U.S. Resolute," the human said. His tone was calm, almost casual, but there was an edge to his voice that caught Xalvar's attention. "We've received your message," Cole continued, "but we're not interested in surrendering. If you want to fight, you'll get one." Laughter erupted across the Zarnak bridge. Xalvar's officers sneered, some outright mocking the audacity of this human. A single ship against their fleet. It was pathetic. Xalvar smirked, leaning back in his chair. "Captain Cole," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm, "I admire your courage, but courage alone will not save you. You are outnumbered, outgunned, and outmatched. What can one fragile human ship possibly do against the might of the Zarnak Empire?" Cole's reply was immediate and sharp. "One ship is all we need." The transmission ended, and Xalvar's smirk faltered slightly. There was something unsettling about the human captain's confidence. For a moment, he wondered if there was more to this situation than met the eye. On board the U.S. Resolute, the mood was tense but focused. The ship was a relic by Zarnak standards, a small frigate barely 200 meters long. Its weapons and shields were outdated, and its crew of 50 seemed laughably small compared to the Zarnak warfleet. Yet none of this seemed to bother Captain Cole. Standing at the center of the bridge, he observed the enemy fleet on the main screen. His officers worked quietly around him, their trust in their captain unshaken. "Are the systems ready?" Cole asked, his voice steady. "Yes, sir," replied Lieutenant Harris, the ship's chief engineer. "All systems are green. Protocol Zeta is prepped and awaiting your command." Cole nodded. "Good. Let's give them a reason to remember us." Back on the Dominion's Wrath, Xalvar grew impatient. "Bring me that human ship," he ordered. "Disable their engines and destroy the rest. Make it quick. I have better things to do than waste time on this nonsense." The Zarnak warfleet moved into formation, their massive ships casting ominous shadows over the stars. They advanced toward the U.S. Resolute, weapons charging and shields shimmering. The humans didn't stand a chance. Or so the Zarnak thought. As the fleet closed in, the U.S. Resolute suddenly moved. Despite its size and age, the ship darted forward with unexpected speed, slipping through the gaps in the Zarnak formation. It fired a volley of small, glowing projectiles, not at the ships, but at seemingly empty space. The Zarnak officers laughed. "Are they firing blind?" One of them scoffed. But then, the projectiles detonated. Waves of energy rippled through space, disrupting the Zarnak ship's shields. Their systems flickered, and some even lost power temporarily. "What is this?" Xalvar demanded, his confidence shaken. On board the U.S. Resolute, Cole smiled grimly. Lesson 1. Never underestimate a human. The first encounter. Supreme Commander Xalvar clenched his fists as the bridge of the Dominion's wrath buzzed with confusion. The shimmering, impenetrable energy shields that defined Zarnak supremacy flickered and dimmed across his fleet. An uneasy silence fell as they realized the human ship had done something no other species had ever managed. It had disrupted their technology. "Status report," Xalvar barked. "Localized shield destabilization, Commander," replied one of his officers. "The energy pulses from their projectiles are resonating with our shield frequencies." "It's impossible. Their level of technology shouldn't allow for this." Xalvar's lips curled into a snarl. "Impossible or not, eliminate them." The Zarnak warfleet surged forward, dozens of ships locking weapons onto the U.S. Resolute, plasma cannons charged with an ominous hum, lighting up the darkness of space. But Captain Adrian Cole was ready. "Evasive maneuvers, Delta pattern," he commanded calmly. The U.S. Resolute danced through space, like a predator dodging clumsy strikes. Despite its size and age, the ship moved with uncanny precision, weaving between Zarnak ships and returning fire with pinpoint accuracy. Its weapons weren't powerful by Zarnak standards, but they were precise. Targeting critical systems, the U.S. Resolute crippled smaller Zarnak ships one by one. Engines exploded, weapons short-circuited, and shields failed. On the Dominion's wrath, Xalvar's confidence wavered as reports of disabled ships poured in. "How are they doing this?" he hissed, turning to his tactical officer. "Their tactics are unconventional, Commander. They're not fighting like other species. They're targeting weak points, using debris, and maneuvering patterns we've never seen before." "Enough excuses," Xalvar roared. "Crush them." The Zarnak ships regrouped, forming an impenetrable wall of firepower. The U.S. Resolute was now surrounded, a lone spark of defiance amidst a storm of overwhelming might. On the Resolute, Lieutenant Harris's voice crackled through the intercom. "Captain, they're closing in. We won't last long in a direct engagement." Cole's eyes remained fixed on the tactical display. His mind raced, calculating probabilities and options. Finally, he gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "It's time," he said. "Activate Protocol Zeta." The crew exchanged uneasy glances. Protocol Zeta was their ace in the hole, an experimental tactic developed in secret. It was risky, untested, and had a slim chance of success. But no one questioned their captain. "Aye, sir," Harris replied, his voice resolute. As the Zarnak ships prepared to fire, the U.S. Resolute released a series of small drones. They scattered in all directions, emitting bursts of electromagnetic interference that disoriented the Zarnak targeting systems. "What now?" Xalvar growled as his tactical display filled with static. The human ship didn't wait for them to recover. It accelerated toward the heart of the Zarnak formation, skimming dangerously close to their warships. The drones followed, creating a chaotic swarm that made it nearly impossible to lock on to the Resolute. Inside the Zarnak fleet, the Resolute unleashed its secret weapon, a pulse cannon designed to disrupt gravitational fields. As the weapon fired, space itself seemed to ripple. The Zarnak ships closest to the blast were thrown into disarray, their trajectories spiraling out of control. Some collided with one another, while others spun helplessly into the void. On the bridge of the Dominion's wrath, Xalvar slammed his fists onto his chair's armrests. "How can one ship do this?" he demanded, his voice a mix of rage and disbelief. "They're using tactics we've never seen before, Commander," his second-in-command stammered. "They're exploiting our blind spots, using the terrain and their limited resources to outmaneuver us." Zalvar's eyes burned with fury. He refused to believe that this primitive species could challenge the Zarnak Empire. But as he watched his fleet struggle against the lone human ship, doubt began to creep into his mind. Meanwhile, on the Resolute, Cole's demeanor remained calm. But he knew the situation was far from over. The Dominion's Wrath was still fully operational, and its weapons could obliterate the Resolute in a single volley if given the chance. "Bring us around," Cole ordered. "We're not done yet." As the Resolute looped back for another attack, the crew worked tirelessly to keep the ship in one piece. Sparks flew from damaged consoles, and alarms blared as the ship's systems strained under the pressure. "We can't keep this up forever, Captain," Harris warned. "We don't need forever," Cole replied, his voice steady. "We just need long enough to show them that humanity won't bow to anyone." The Resolute fired another volley of precision missiles, this time aimed at the Dominion's Wrath. Though the Zarnak flagship's shields absorbed most of the impact, the attacks were enough to rattle the mighty ship. Zalvar glared at the image of the human vessel on his screen. For the first time in his long career, he felt something he hadn't experienced in decades. Uncertainty. "They're stalling us," he muttered to himself. "But why? What are they planning?" The answer to that question would come soon enough, and it would shake the Zarnak Empire to its core. The hidden strength of humanity. Supreme Commander Zalvar paced the bridge of the Dominion's Wrath. His claws clicked against the polished floor, the only sound apart from the low hum of the ship's engines. The human ship continued to defy his expectations, slipping through his fleet's attempts to surround it. "How is this possible?" Zalvar muttered, his tone laced with frustration. "What could one insignificant ship possibly have that we don't?" His tactical officer hesitated before answering. "Commander, their tactics. They're unlike anything we've encountered. Their movements, their weaponry. It's as if they've spent years preparing for this exact scenario." The word preparing stuck in Zalvar's mind. This wasn't an act of desperation. It was strategy. Purposeful, calculated. On board the U.S. Resolute, Captain Adrian Cole stood at the center of his crew, his presence a steadying force amidst the chaos. Sparks flew from damaged consoles, and engineers scrambled to reroute power to critical systems. Despite the chaos, there was no panic. Every crew member moved with precision and focus, like parts of a well-oiled machine. "Captain, the Zarnak fleet is adapting," Lieutenant Harris reported, his voice strained but steady. "They're compensating for the shield disruption. We won't have that advantage for much longer." Cole nodded, his expression unreadable. "They'll adapt quickly, but that's not our concern right now." "Are the phase emitters ready?" Harris hesitated. "Yes, but they've never been tested in live combat." "If they fail?" "They won't," Cole interrupted firmly. "This crew hasn't trained for failure. We train to win." The Resolute banked sharply, avoiding another barrage of plasma fire. Its movements were erratic, unpredictable, an intentional strategy that left the Zarnak commanders guessing. Cole's voice rang out over the intercom, steady and calm. "Crew of the Resolute, this is your captain. I know what you're feeling. The Zarnak Empire is the most feared force in the galaxy. They've conquered species far more advanced than us. But we are not them. We are human. We've faced extinction before, and we've always found a way to survive. This moment is no different." A quiet murmur of determination spread through the crew. They were exhausted, outnumbered, and outgunned. But Cole's words ignited something within them: pride. As the battle raged, flashbacks revealed the true story behind humanity's rise. Years earlier, when humanity first encountered the Zarnak Empire, the Terran Federation knew they stood no chance in a direct confrontation. The Zarnak were centuries ahead in technology, their ships and weapons light years beyond anything humanity could build. But humanity's strength had never been in brute force. It had always been in adaptability, in creativity. The Federation had secretly shifted its focus from building massive fleets to developing unconventional technologies. They worked in secret laboratories on weapons and tactics the Zarnak couldn't predict. Strategies born not of arrogance, but necessity. The Resolute was the culmination of those efforts, an experimental frigate designed not to overpower, but to outthink and outmaneuver. It carried prototype systems the Zarnak would never expect. Systems that could turn the tide of battle, even against impossible odds. Back in the present, the Resolute unleashed its next surprise. The phase emitters, devices capable of bending light and distorting sensor readings, activated, cloaking the ship in a shimmering distortion field. On the Dominion's Wrath, the tactical display erupted into chaos. "Where are they?" Zalvar demanded, his voice rising in anger. "They've disappeared," his officer stammered. "Their ship's signature is gone. We can't track them." Invisible to the Zarnak fleet, the Resolute began its counterattack. Emerging from the distortion field in brief bursts, it targeted the engines and weapons of key Zarnak ships. Each strike was precise, designed to disable rather than destroy. Zalvar's frustration grew with each passing moment. He had always prided himself on his ability to anticipate an enemy's moves, to outthink and outmaneuver even the most cunning opponents. But these humans were different. They fought with a blend of ingenuity and unpredictability that defied logic. Inside the Resolute, the atmosphere was tense but focused. Harris monitored the phase emitters, watching for any signs of failure. "Emitters holding steady," he reported, relief evident in his voice. "Good," Cole replied. "Let's not give them a chance to recover." He turned to his helmsman. "Take us closer to their flagship." The helmsman hesitated. "Sir, that's the most heavily armed ship in their fleet." "I know," Cole said, his tone unwavering. "That's why we're going there. They need to know we're not afraid of them." The Resolute darted toward the Dominion's Wrath, its distortion field flickering as the ship pushed its systems to their limits. The Zarnak fleet scrambled to protect their flagship, but their movements were disorganized, chaotic. The humans had thrown them off balance. On the bridge of the Dominion's Wrath, Zalvar watched in disbelief as the human ship approached. His officers looked to him for guidance, their confidence shaken. "Fire everything," Zalvar growled. "If they want to challenge us, let them see the full power of the Zarnak Empire." The Dominion's Wrath unleashed a devastating barrage of plasma fire, lighting up the void. The Resolute twisted and turned, evading most of the shots. But a few found their mark. The human ship shuddered, its hull scorched and scarred. "Damage report," Cole barked. "Minor breaches on decks 3 and 4, Harris replied. "Shields down to 40%. We're still in the fight." Cole allowed himself a brief smile. "Good. Let's remind them why humans are never underestimated." As the Resolute closed in on the Zarnak flagship, it prepared to deliver its final move. The battle was far from over, but one thing was clear. Humanity was not the weak, insignificant species the Zarnak had thought. They were something far more dangerous. The Zarnak's counterattack. Supreme Commander Zalvar stood motionless on the bridge of the Dominion's Wrath, his yellow eyes locked onto the display of the human ship darting through his fleet. The humans were unlike any species he had faced before. They didn't crumble under superior firepower. They didn't retreat in the face of overwhelming numbers. They adapted. The U.S. Resolute had inflicted more damage in a single engagement than any adversary had managed in decades. Zalvar's officers whispered nervously, stealing glances at him as if waiting for an explosion of fury. But Zalvar wasn't angry. Not yet. Instead, he smiled, a cold, predatory grin. "So," he muttered, "they want to play a game of strategy." He straightened and turned to his crew, his voice booming. "No more underestimating them. All ships, regroup into formation theta. Lure them into the kill zone." The Resolute continued its hit-and-run attacks, striking vulnerable Zarnak ships before vanishing back into its distortion field. On board, Captain Adrian Cole monitored the tactical display, his sharp eyes catching every detail. "They're pulling back," Lieutenant Harris noted, his voice tinged with suspicion. Cole nodded. "They're consolidating their forces. They think we've been lucky so far, but now they're taking us seriously. Should we keep pressing the attack?" Cole thought for a moment, then shook his head. "No, that's what they want. They're trying to draw us in, but we're not walking into their trap." "Then what's the plan?" Cole smiled faintly. "We make them think we already have." As the Zarnak fleet tightened its formation, Zalvar watched with satisfaction. The humans were moving closer, right where he wanted them. "Maintain positions," he ordered. "Wait for my signal." But something felt off. The human ship wasn't behaving like a desperate opponent. It wasn't panicking, wasn't rushing headlong into his fleet. Instead, it moved with an unsettling precision, its maneuvers calculated and deliberate. "What are they doing?" Zalvar muttered, his brow furrowing. Inside the Resolute, the bridge was a flurry of controlled activity. Cole's crew worked tirelessly, their trust in their captain unshaken. "Enemy fleet is holding position," Harris reported. "They're waiting for us to commit." Cole leaned forward, studying the tactical display. "Good. Let them wait." He activated the ship's intercom, addressing the entire crew. "Listen up, everyone. The Zarnak think they've outsmarted us. They've built a trap, and they're hoping we'll step right into it. But here's the thing about traps. They work both ways." His words sent a ripple of determination through the crew. They weren't just surviving, they were fighting to win. Suddenly, the Zarnak fleet sprang into action. At Zalvar's command, a massive wave of drones launched from his ships, swarming toward the Resolute. Each drone was small but heavily armed, designed to overwhelm enemies with sheer numbers. Cole's eyes narrowed. "There it is," he muttered. The drones closed in, their plasma weapons firing in unison. The Resolute's shields flared under the onslaught, alarms blaring as the ship took heavy fire. "They're swarming us," shouted Lieutenant Harris. "Deploy countermeasures," Cole ordered calmly. The Resolute released a burst of electromagnetic pulses, frying the circuitry of many drones. But the Zarnak had anticipated this. The remaining drones adjusted their approach, spreading out to avoid the pulses. "They're adapting faster," Harris warned. "We can't hold them off forever." Cole's mind raced. The Zarnak had taken the bait, committing their forces to the attack. Now it was time to turn the tables. "Divert power to forward thrusters," Cole commanded. "We're going straight for their flagship." The crew exchanged uneasy glances but obeyed without hesitation. The Resolute surged forward, its engines roaring as it cut through the swarm of drones. Zalvar watched the human ship's approach with a mix of amusement and irritation. "They're desperate," he sneered. "They think they can take us down by targeting the Dominion's wrath. Prepare all weapons. End this foolishness." As the Resolute closed the distance, it fired a spread of missiles, not at the flagship, but at the debris field nearby. The explosion sent a cloud of shrapnel hurtling toward the Zarnak drones, disabling many and forcing the rest to scatter. On board the Dominion's wrath, Zalvar's amusement faded. What are they doing? Why waste their missiles like that? Then he realized. The debris cloud wasn't a random attack. It was a smokescreen designed to obscure the Resolute's movements. The human ship vanished into the chaos, its distortion field making it nearly impossible to track. "They're closing in," shouted a Zarnak officer. "Impossible," Zalvar snarled. Inside the Resolute, Cole's voice rang out over the intercom. "This is it, people. We're going to remind the Zarnak why humanity doesn't back down. Prepare for Phase 2. As the Resolute emerged from the debris cloud, it unleashed its most devastating weapon yet, a concentrated graviton beam aimed directly at the Dominion's wrath. The Zarnak flagship's shields flared, struggling to absorb the impact. Zalvar staggered as the ship trembled under the force of the attack. "Damage report," he barked. "Shields are collapsing, Commander." Zalvar's claws dug into the armrests of his chair. This wasn't how the battle was supposed to go. The Zarnak were the apex predators of the galaxy, yet here they were, being outmaneuvered and outsmarted by a single human ship. "They think this is over," Zalvar growled, his eyes narrowing. "But we're far from done." The Dominion's wrath unleashed a devastating counterattack, its plasma cannons firing in all directions. The Resolute twisted and turned, evading most of the shots, but the relentless assault began to take its toll. "Shields down to 20%, Harris reported, sweat beading on his brow. Cole's jaw tightened. The battle wasn't over, but he knew one thing for certain. The Zarnak were no longer laughing. Humanity had earned their attention and their fear. The turning point. The U.S. Resolute shuddered violently as plasma fire grazed its hull. Sparks erupted from a console on the bridge, and a crew member scrambled to extinguish the flames. The alarm screamed, but Captain Adrian Cole's voice cut through the chaos, calm and unyielding. "Stay focused. Damage report." Lieutenant Harris, his face streaked with sweat and soot, replied. "Shields are down to 10%. Hull integrity is at critical levels in some sections. We're running out of time, Captain." Cole nodded, his expression unreadable. The crew knew him well enough to understand what that meant. He had a plan, but it wasn't one they'd like. "Engineering," Cole said, tapping his comms. "Prepare to overload the fusion core." A sharp intake of breath swept through the bridge. Overloading the fusion core wasn't just risky, it was suicidal. Harris turned toward Cole, his voice almost pleading. "Captain, that'll tear the ship apart." Cole met Harris's gaze with steely resolve. "It'll tear them apart too. We're not here to survive. We're here to win." On the Dominion's wrath, Supreme Commander Zalvar stood tall, his claws gripping the edge of the tactical console. The human ship was barely holding together, its shields flickering like a dying flame. Victory was within reach, and yet, "Something's not right," Zalvar muttered. His second-in-command glanced at him nervously. "Commander, they're severely damaged. They can't possibly." "Don't underestimate them," Zalvar snapped. "They've been cornered before, and each time they've turned it into an advantage. I want every ship in the fleet to focus fire on that vessel. Do not let them close the gap." The fleet adjusted its formation, tightening around the Resolute like a noose. Plasma fire rained down, and the Resolute twisted desperately to evade. On the bridge of the Resolute, Cole watched the tactical display with narrowed eyes. The Zarnak fleet was moving exactly as he'd anticipated. They were confident, aggressive, and predictable. "Helm," he ordered, "take us into the asteroid field." The helmsman hesitated. The asteroid field was dense, a labyrinth of spinning rock and metal debris. Navigating it at their current speed was suicidal. "Captain, are you sure?" "Do it," Cole said firmly. The Resolute plunged into the asteroid field, its engines roaring as it weaved through the treacherous terrain. The Zarnak fleet hesitated for a moment before pursuing, their larger ships struggling to maneuver in the confined space. Zalvar's frustration boiled over. "Fools," he bellowed at his officers. "They're trying to hide. Pursue them. Destroy them." The Zarnak ships followed the Resolute into the asteroid field, their plasma cannons firing wildly. But the confined space worked against them. A stray plasma shot struck an asteroid, sending a massive chunk of rock hurtling into a Zarnak cruiser. The ship exploded in a brilliant flash, the debris colliding with more Zarnak vessels. Cole's voice echoed over the intercom. "They're not used to fighting on someone else's terms. Use the field to your advantage. Keep moving, keep them guessing." The Resolute darted through the chaos, firing precision missiles at key Zarnak ships. The human crew worked in perfect unison, their training and ingenuity shining through. Despite their damaged ship, they were outmaneuvering an entire fleet. Then came the moment Cole had been waiting for. Engineering, he called. Begin the fusion core overload. And Harris turned, dread evident in his eyes. Prep the escape pods, Cole said quietly. On the Dominion's wrath, Zalvar watched the human ship slow down. Its movements became erratic. Its energy readings spiked wildly. They're losing control, a Zarnak officer exclaimed. No, Zalvar said, his eyes narrowing. They're planning something. As the Resolute reached the densest part of the asteroid field, its engines flared one last time, sending it hurtling toward the largest asteroid in the region. The Zarnak fleet pursued, their formation tightening to ensure no escape. Cole's voice rang out on the intercom. All hands, abandon ship. Repeat, abandon ship. The crew hesitated for only a moment before rushing to the escape pods. Cole remained on the bridge, his hand steady on the controls. Captain, what about you? Harris's voice crackled over the comms. I'll be right behind you, Cole lied. Moments later, the Resolute's escape pods launched, scattering like fireflies into the darkness. The Zarnak fleet ignored them, focusing entirely on the ship itself. On the Dominion's wrath, Zalvar watched as the Resolute collided with the massive asteroid. A split second later, the overloaded fusion core detonated. The explosion was catastrophic, a blinding wave of energy that tore through the asteroid field. The shockwave obliterated dozens of Zarnak ships, including some of their largest war vessels. The Dominion's wrath shuddered violently, its shields barely holding as the bridge lights flickered. In the aftermath, Zalvar stared at the wreckage in stunned silence. The human ship was gone, but so was nearly half of his fleet. The arrogance that had filled the Zarnak bridge at the beginning of the battle was replaced by a cold, creeping fear. Commander, an officer said hesitantly, We've lost contact with the flagship escorts. Zalvar's claws trembled as he gripped the edge of his console. They sacrificed their ship, just to cripple us. They're mad. No, the officer replied, his voice shaking. They're brilliant. As the Zarnak regrouped, the human escape pods drifted toward a hidden rendezvous point, a small Terran cruiser waiting on the edge of the battlefield. The crew of the Resolute was battered, bruised, but alive. And the galaxy had just witnessed the impossible. Humanity had faced the might of the Zarnak Empire and turned the tide. The lesson in respect. The battlefield was silent, save for the faint hum of Zarnak engines struggling to stabilize. Shattered remnants of their once mighty fleet drifted aimlessly in the void, glowing faintly in the aftermath of the Resolute's final act. Supreme Commander Zalvar sat motionless on the bridge of the Dominion's wrath, his claws digging into the armrests of his command chair. Damage report, he growled, his voice low and venomous. An officer hesitated, visibly shaken. Commander, half our fleet is destroyed. Many of the remaining ships are heavily damaged. We've lost propulsion on the Dominion's wrath. Shields are at 8%, weapons offline. The humans, they crippled us. The last words came out almost as a whisper, as if the officer himself couldn't believe them. Zalvar's yellow eyes narrowed. And the human ship? Gone, the officer replied. But escape pods were detected leaving the blast zone. Some of their crew survived. Zalvar's gaze hardened. Then this is not over. On the far edge of the battlefield, a small Terran cruiser emerged from its cloaked position. It had remained hidden during the battle, waiting for the precise moment to act. Now, it moved swiftly to collect the scattered escape pods from the Resolute. Inside one of the pods, Captain Adrian Cole sat in silence, his face illuminated by the flickering emergency lights. He stared out at the stars, his expression unreadable. The loss of the Resolute weighed heavily on him, but the faintest glimmer of satisfaction lingered in his eyes. They had succeeded. The hatch to his pod opened with a hiss, and a young ensign helped him aboard the cruiser. Captain Cole, she said, her voice filled with awe. You did it. You stopped them. Cole's gaze shifted to the bridge, where the crew of the cruiser worked diligently. "We bought time," he corrected. "But this isn't over. The Zarnak don't take defeat lightly." On the Dominion's wrath, Zalvar paced the ruined bridge. His crew worked frantically to restore power, but the damage was extensive. He stopped in front of the communications console, his claws tapping against the metal surface. "Open a channel," he ordered. "Commander," his second-in-command asked hesitantly. "To the humans," Zalvar snapped. "Now." The communications officer hesitated but obeyed. Moments later, the face of Captain Cole appeared on the screen, bruised but unyielding. The Zarnak bridge fell silent as they stared at the human who had outsmarted them. Zalvar stepped forward, his imposing figure filling the screen. "Captain Adrian Cole," he said, his voice low and deliberate. "You've proven resourceful. I'll grant you that. But this victory is temporary. Humanity will suffer for this insult." Cole's expression didn't waver. "You misunderstand, Commander. This wasn't about victory. It was about teaching you a lesson." Zalvar sneered. "And what lesson is that?" Cole leaned forward, his gray eyes cold as steel. "That humanity doesn't bow. You can throw your fleets, your weapons, your empire at us, and we'll still stand. You may have power, but we have something you'll never understand: resilience." For a moment, Zalvar was silent, his arrogance colliding with the reality of his defeat. The screen crackled slightly as the two commanders stared each other down. Meanwhile, the Zarnak crew exchanged nervous glances. For centuries, they had been taught that the Zarnak Empire was invincible, that no species could challenge their might. Yet here they were, humbled by a species they had dismissed as weak. "Commander," an officer spoke hesitantly, breaking the silence. "What are your orders?" Zalvar turned away from the screen, his jaw clenched. "Withdraw. Regroup with the remaining fleet. This battle is over." The words tasted bitter, but he knew the truth. They couldn't afford another engagement. Not now. As the Zarnak ships limped away, the Terran cruiser watched from a safe distance. The crew of the Resolute gathered in the mess hall, a mix of relief and exhaustion evident on their faces. Captain Cole stood at the center, his presence commanding but not overbearing. "We survived," he began, his voice carrying through the room. "Not because we were stronger, not because we were faster, but because we were smarter, because we trusted each other, and because we refused to give up." The crew erupted into applause, their spirits lifting despite the losses they had endured. Back in Zarnak space, whispers of the human defiance spread like wildfire. The Empire, once so sure of its dominance, now faced an enemy they couldn't intimidate. Supreme Commander Zalvar returned to the Zarnak Council, his defeat evident in his scared and weary appearance. As he recounted the battle, the council members exchanged uneasy glances. They were different, Zalvar admitted reluctantly. Their ship was inferior, their numbers insignificant. But their minds, their strategies, they fought as if the void itself was their ally. The council chamber fell silent. The Zarnak Empire, for the first time in centuries, had been forced to reconsider its view of the galaxy. As the Terran cruiser disappeared into hyperspace, Captain Cole looked out at the stars. The battle was over, but the war was just beginning. The Zarnak Empire had been humbled, but they wouldn't forget this defeat, and neither would humanity. Aftermath, and a warning. The silence of space lingered like a deep exhale after the chaos of battle. The fractured remains of the Zarnak fleet limped back to their territory, their once pristine warships now scarred monuments to their arrogance. The Terran cruiser carrying the survivors of the Resolute slipped through hyperspace, its destination, Earth. Captain Adrian Cole stood on the observation deck, the stars streaking past as the ship sped home. His reflection in the glass was worn and weary, but his eyes burned with resolve. The battle was a victory, but it wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something much larger. In the heart of Zarnak Prime, Supreme Commander Zalvar faced the Council of Elders. The chamber was vast, filled with cold blue light that emphasized the unforgiving lines of the ancient Zarnak architecture. Zalvar, once a towering figure of confidence, now looked diminished, his uniform torn, and his pride wounded. "You brought shame upon the Empire," hissed one of the elders, his voice echoing like a blade against steel. Zalvar's claws flexed, but he bowed his head. "The humans, they are not like the others we faced. They think differently, fight differently. They exploited our strengths and turned them into weaknesses. They are primitives." Another elder spat. "One ship against an armada. Their victory was a fluke." Zalvar raised his head, his yellow eyes burning with defiance. "No, it was no fluke. They are a threat, not because of their weapons, but because of their will. If we do not respect that, we will lose more than a battle." The council chamber fell into uneasy silence. For the first time, the Zarnak Empire had been forced to reconsider its invincibility. On Earth, the return of the Resolute's crew sparked a wave of both relief and determination. The Terran Federation declared the battle a victory for all of humanity, but the celebration was tempered by the knowledge that this was only the first clash in a much larger war. At the debriefing, Captain Cole addressed the Federation's highest-ranking officials. The room was filled with admirals, politicians, and scientists, all eager to hear from the man who had defied the Zarnak Empire. Cole stood at the podium, his uniform crisp despite the bruises that hadn't fully faded. His voice was calm but carried the weight of his message. "The Zarnak are wounded, but they are not defeated," he began. "They will return, stronger and more determined. They will underestimate us again, but not forever." This battle was a message, a reminder that humanity is not to be trifled with. But we cannot rest on this victory. We must prepare for the war that's coming. The room fell silent, the weight of his words sinking in. Across the galaxy, news of the battle spread like wildfire. Species long subjugated by the Zarnak Empire began to whisper of resistance. If humanity could stand against the Zarnak, perhaps others could too. Rebellion simmered on the edges of Zarnak-controlled space, small sparks of defiance waiting to ignite. On a distant mining colony, a small group of aliens huddled around a holographic broadcast of the battle. The image of the Resolute standing alone against the Zarnak fleet played on a loop, inspiring awe and hope. "They fought them," one alien whispered, "and they survived." Back on Earth, Cole sat in a quiet briefing room with his closest advisors. Lieutenant Harris, now promoted after his actions during the battle, leaned forward, a frown etched on his face. "The Zarnak will come back, Captain. And when they do, they'll bring their entire empire with them." Cole nodded. "Good. Let them. We've already proven one thing. They can bleed." Harris hesitated, then asked, "And if they don't just stop at retaliation? What if they try to destroy us completely?" Cole's gaze hardened. "Then we remind them why humanity always survives. Adaptation, resilience, unity. These are the things no empire, no matter how powerful, can conquer." The story ends with the U.S. Resolute's name etched into the history books, not as a ship that fell, but as a symbol of defiance. Across human space, preparations for the inevitable continue. New ships are built, alliances are formed, and humanity stands ready. And in the void, far from Earth, a Zarnak probe drifts silently, recording the wreckage of their once proud fleet. The data it carries will return to Zarnak Prime, but even the cold calculations of its programming cannot erase the warning etched into its final report. Humanity cannot be underestimated. Their greatest weapon is not their technology. It is their spirit.